In the heart and bustling city of Lagos, there stood a church unlike any other. The sign outside read Burning Bush Ministry, but what made it different wasn't its name, it was its rules. No member was allowed to bring a Bible into the church or read the Bible during the church services. Every Sunday, people lined up outside, their hands empty. No Bibles, no hymn books, nothing. At the door, ushers in crisp white uniforms checked each person. No Bibles allowed, they reminded anyone who forgot the rule. Pastor Matthew, a tall man with sharp eyes and a commanding voice, stood on the pulpit. He was known across the city for his powerful sermons. Some called him a prophet, others whispered that he had powers beyond human understanding. Faith, he often said, is not in the book. It is in your heart. At first, people found it strange. Why would a pastor ban Bibles in a church? But Pastor Matthew's words were like fire. He spoke with such conviction that his members believed him without question. His church grew bigger, and soon, Burning Bush Ministry became one of the most popular churches in the city. Pastor Matthew was not just a man of words, he was a man of wonders. His reputation stretched far beyond Lagos, reaching towns and villages where people spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. Stories of his miraculous deeds filled the air like tales of old. They said he could heal the sick with a single touch. Every month, Pastor Matthew announced new scholarships for students. Young boys and girls who had lost hope of ever attending school suddenly found themselves in prestigious institutions, their fees paid in full. A true man of God, they said. But few ever questioned how Pastor Matthew performed his miracles. Some believed he had a special anointing, a divine gift that set him apart from ordinary men. Others didn't care to ask. As long as their prayers were answered, as long as the miracles continued, the how didn't matter. Some members went as far as fighting anyone who spoke against the pastor. Sunday arrived, and Burning Bush Ministry was packed. People filled every seat, their faces shining with hope and expectation. The choir's voices rose in harmony, filling the air with songs of praise. Then, the room grew silent as Pastor Matthew stepped onto the pulpit. His presence commanded attention, tall, confident, and dressed in a pristine white suit that seemed to glow under the church lights. Today, he began, his voice deep and powerful, the Lord will do wonders in this place. Pastor Matthew lifted his hands, and ushers helped a crippled woman to the front. Her legs were bent at awkward angles, and she leaned heavily on a crutch. This woman, he announced, has not walked in 10 years. The crowd gasped. Pastor Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes closed in prayer. He spoke in a language nobody understood, his words rhythmic and commanding. Then, suddenly, he shouted, "Rise." The woman trembled, her legs shaking. Slowly, she stood, first on one foot, then the other. Within moments, she was walking, then began running in the front of the church. Tears streamed down her face as the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. "Praise the Lord," people shouted. But not everyone was convinced. Among the congregation was a young lady named Rachel. A 27-year-old lady. She had heard about the pastor's miracles and healing powers, and because of this she traveled all the way from Imo State to Lagos, wanting to get her share of the miracles. Regarding her unending setbacks in getting a marriage mate and with hopes, she came to seek for deliverance. But things didn't go well as planned because she came with her copy of the Bible. On the Sunday she came to the church, it was massive as usual, but at the entrance to the church she was stopped by the ushers and her Bible was taken from her. It looked strange to her, but she didn't want to create a scene, so she obeyed and handed the Bible over to them. Rachel went into the church and was marveled at the structure of the church and also the painting on the wall. But not long after the sermon would soon kick off, there were choirs singing songs of praises with the whole congregation singing alongside with their spirits lifted high. But with curious eyes Rachel noticed that something was missing. When Pastor Matthew started preaching, he never read the Bible or cited a portion of the Bible. He never mentioned the name of the Lord. Rachel was shocked because she loved reading the Bible. Her parents taught them to read the Bible daily, to pray constantly, and to always call on the name of the Lord, but here everything seemed different and out of place. But Ada felt something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed, Rachel couldn't sleep. Questions bothered her mind. What was Pastor Matthew hiding? Why were Bibles forbidden? Why would a pastor not want people to read the Bible? One evening, Rachel sat on the front steps of her rented apartment, listening to her neighbors talk about Pastor Matthew. "My cousin's daughter was blind," an elderly woman said. She touched Pastor Matthew's robe, and now she can see. My brother's son got a scholarship, another added. We prayed for years, and Pastor Matthew made it happen. Rachel listened quietly, her mind racing. She had seen the miracles too. She had watched people walk into the church with crutches and walk out without them. But something didn't sit right with her. Why would a man of God fear the holy book? What if the miracles weren't as pure as everyone believed? What if there was a secret behind Pastor Matthew's power? Rachel thought within herself. And if there was a secret, Rachel was determined to uncover it. The next Sunday arrived, and Burning Bush Ministry was as crowded as ever. People poured in from every corner of Lagos, their hearts full of faith, their minds fixed on the miracles they hoped to witness. But before coming to the church, Rachel had a different purpose. She had carefully placed a small Bible into her purse. It was a pocket-sized Bible, worn from years of reading. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her purse. This is it, she thought. Today, I'll find out the truth. At the church entrance, the usual ushers were on duty, their eyes scanning every bag and pocket. Rachel clutched her purse tightly. When her turn came, she smiled innocently as the usher glanced inside. He saw her notebook, a pen, and a handkerchief, nothing unusual. He waved her through. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped into the church, her heart pounding. She made her way to her usual seat near the middle, where she won't be easily spotted by any usher. The service began like any other. The choir sang, filling the air with melodies that lifted the spirits of the congregation. Pastor Matthew stepped onto the pulpit, his presence as commanding as ever. Today, he declared, the Lord will move among us. Miracles will flow like rivers. The congregation cheered. But Rachel noticed something different. Pastor Matthew's eyes seemed to dart around the room more than usual, as if he sensed something was off. He began his preaching, speaking with his usual power and conviction. But halfway through his message, he paused. His hands gripped the sides of the pulpit tightly, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. Rachel's pulse quickened. He knows, she thought. Pastor Matthew continued, but his words were slower, less certain. He wiped sweat from his forehead and glanced around the room again, his eyes sharp and searching. Then something strange happened. The pulpit began to vibrate, softly at first, then more violently. A low rumble filled the air, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. People in the congregation gasped, looking around in confusion. Pastor Matthew gripped the pulpit tighter, his knuckles white. His face, usually calm and composed, twisted with anger. Something is wrong, his voice echoing through the church. The vibration grew stronger, shaking the chairs and the walls. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Fear spread like wildfire among the congregation. Everyone remained calm. Pastor Matthew commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Pastor Matthew's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, they locked with Rachel's. His gaze was filled with fury, as if he knew exactly where the disturbance was coming from. He stepped down from the pulpit, his movement slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Someone, he said, his voice low and menacing, has brought something into this holy place that does not belong. The congregation fell silent, fear etched on every face. Rachel held her fist, willing herself to stay calm. The Bible in her purse seemed to pulse with energy, each vibration shaking the very foundation of the church. She could feel its power, like a heartbeat, steady and strong. Pastor Matthew's face twisted with rage. Who dares to defy the house of God? He thundered. The vibrations intensified, and cracks began to appear in the walls. Rachel knew they were moments away from disaster. She had to act, but what could she do? Exposing the Bible now would reveal her secret, and Pastor Matthew's wrath would be swift. Pastor Matthew stumbled back toward the pulpit, trying to steady himself. The vibrations only grew stronger, as if the church itself was rejecting his authority. Rachel's eyes widened as a realization struck her. The Bible, it's exposing him. For the first time, Pastor Matthew looked truly afraid. His power, his control over the church, was slipping away, and he knew it. Pastor Matthew stumbled back from the pulpit, his face a mask of fury and fear. Suddenly, with a deafening crack, the pulpit split wide open. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation as something slithered out from the gaping hole in the floor, a massive snake, its scales dark and gleaming, its eyes glowing a fiery red. The creature coiled around the broken pieces of the pulpit, its forked tongue flicking in and out as it hissed menacingly. The air grew heavy, and a chilling silence fell over the church. One by one, the people froze in their seats, their eyes wide with terror but their bodies completely still, as if an invisible force had cast a spell over them. Everyone was paralyzed, everyone except Rachel. She clutched the small Bible in her purse, her fingers trembling but steady. Somehow, the spell didn't touch her. She could feel the Bible's warmth, a steady pulse of energy that shielded her from the dark power now consuming the church. Rachel looked around in horror as the once beautiful paintings on the walls began to shift and change. The serene images of angels and saints twisted into grotesque shapes, their faces contorted with malice. Their wings darkened, transforming into leathery appendages, and within moments, the paintings broke free from the walls. They weren't paintings anymore. They were demons, winged, snarling creatures that hovered above the frozen congregation, their eyes glowing with wicked delight. Rachel's heart raced, but she knew she had to stay calm. She slipped her hand into her purse and gripped the Bible tightly. Closing her eyes, she began to pray silently, her lips moving without sound. The snake hissed louder, its body coiling tighter around the shattered pulpit as if it sensed her prayers. Pastor Matthew staggered forward, his eyes wide with rage and desperation. He raised his hands as if to command the creatures, but his voice faltered. The power he once wielded was slipping away. The demons screeched, their forms flickering as if struggling to maintain their shape. The snake writhed, its glowing eyes fixed on Rachel. It lunged toward her, but an unseen force stopped it mid-strike, as if an invisible wall of light had blocked its path. Pastor Matthew fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. "No, no," he cried, his voice filled with agony. "I command you, obey me." But his commands fell on deaf ears. The power that had once made him a feared and revered figure was gone, unraveling with each word of Rachel's prayer. The demons shrieked, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke that vanished into the air. The snake convulsed violently before letting out one final, piercing hiss. With a burst of light, it dissolved into nothingness. The heavy atmosphere lifted, and the congregation began to stir. One by one, they came back to their senses, blinking in confusion and terror as they took in the scene before them. Pastor Matthew, once a symbol of power and miracles, now looked small and broken. Rachel took a deep breath, her heart still pounding. She had uncovered the truth. Pastor Matthew remained on his knees at the front of the ruined church, his body trembling, his once proud shoulders now slumped in defeat. "Many years ago, when I started this church, it was small. I struggled. I wanted to grow the church, to make it a place where people would come from far and wide. I prayed, but it wasn't enough, or so I thought." He lowered his head, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. "One night, in my desperation, I was approached by something dark. It offered me power to heal, to perform miracles, to grow the church. All I had to do was accept." He paused, his hands clenched into fists. "I made a deal with the darkness never to make use of the Bible in my church and never to speak of the Lord. I thought I could control it. I thought I could use it for good. But I was wrong." The crowd listened in stunned silence, their faces a mix of horror and betrayal. "The power you saw, the miracles you believed in, were not from God. They were from the forces I invited into this church. And today, that darkness was exposed." Pastor Matthew's voice broke, and he covered his face with his hands. "I have put your souls in danger." Rachel stepped forward, her heart aching at the sight of the broken man before her. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Some members of the church began to weep, their faces filled with regret. They thought of the years they had spent in the burning bush ministry, blindly following a man whose power came from a source they never questioned. Others quietly gathered their belongings, their eyes filled with sorrow. They left the church, their footsteps heavy with regret, vowing never to return. As the congregation slowly dispersed, the air in the church grew calm, but the memories of what had transpired remained heavy on their hearts. And in the quiet moments, as the congregation knelt in prayer, they knew one thing for certain: they had been deceived once, but never again. They would remain vigilant, prayerful, and faithful, trusting not in signs and wonders, but in the God who had delivered them from darkness into his marvelous light. The journey had been difficult, but their faith had been refined, and their hearts were now anchored in the truth. Thank you for watching my video today. If you enjoyed this story and found it thought-provoking, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the events in the church? Have you ever encountered something similar or learned an important lesson about faith? Share your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to read them. Don't forget to like this video if you found it inspiring, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated whenever a new video drops. Your support means the world to me, and together, we can continue sharing stories that inspire faith, encourage truth, and uplift hearts. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.